today. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, lands that always were and always will be Aboriginal land. The main campus of the University of Sydney, where I usually work, is on Gadigal land. But today, under lockdown, I'm on the land of the Wallumattagal, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So welcome to the Digital Health and Informatics Network for our August seminar. And before we start going into today's talk, let me also begin by explaining that we've sort of entered a new phase in the Digital Health and Informatics Network, which was originally started and managed by Tim Shaw, Jonathan Morris, and Heiko Spalek. And now it's going to be my job to sort of live up to the expectations that they've set for the network as the new network convener. And as always, we have to thank Jack Wells, who's essentially the driving force behind everything that a network does. And it's the reason that we are a group of more than 950 people, half from academia and the other half comprising health professionals and other members of the community. Okay, so before we start on today's talk, let me just remind you that tell you that in 4 weeks' time, exactly 4 weeks' time from now, we're going to have another seminar, and that's going to be on human-centered design and presented by Tom Loveday, who's the Director of Design at eHealth New South Wales. But that's in 4 weeks' time. But today, we're extremely lucky to have Kathleen Yin. Kathleen Yin works at the Centre for Health Informatics in the Australian Institute of Health Innovation at Macquarie University. And I've known Kathleen for, I'm going to say 5 years, Kathleen?
5 years, yeah.
5 years. And so everything that I know about serious games and gamification comes from Kathleen, and I feel slightly more knowledgeable than I did 5 years ago about these things. So Kathleen's a kind of a senior member of the serious games community around the world, and she is, for example, a member of the Board of Trustees for Games for Change Asia Pacific, and she's also on the steering committee of Serious Games Special Interest Group at the International Game Developers Association. Kind of the coolest area of research to possibly be in if you're interested in computer games. So today, Kathleen is going to be talking about video games, exercise, and keeping me sane during COVID-19. And without spoiling it, I'll hand over straight to Kathleen to begin. Thanks, Kathleen.
All right, thank you, Adam. So today's talk is roughly in 2 parts. I'm going to be spending about 20 minutes talking about serious games in general, a general update and information on what exactly I mean when I talk about serious games. And in the second part, I will specifically talk about my project, which looked into the use of games to supplement exercise and mental health during COVID-19. All right, so just click. Really quickly about me, thank you for your introduction, Adam, once again. So I work in Macquarie University in Sydney. Before I came to Macquarie, I have a background in pharmacy, and I actually did a PhD in pharmacology. So I was one of those people working with rodent models in the lab and doing dissections. But somewhere along the way, I ended up in the world of using games and interactive media for behavior change. So some of my non-academic titles are, co-founder Serious Games Australia, New Zealand, lots of commercial and community serious game stuff. And my main passion is about linking the world of developers with academics. So together we can actually create digital media that's effective and evidence-based and fun for people to play so they have a better health outcome. So I'm just going to start by asking the question of what is a game? Now, a lot of people have a different concept of what a game is whenever I ask this question. Some of the common responses I get is games are fun, or games are competitive, or games revolve people challenging each other or challenging the rules set up by the game. So a very broad, very generic definition is actually that a game is something that exists inside either a physical or psychological magic circle within which all the players must obey certain immutable rules. And that definition is put forward by Johan Huizinga in 1938, who is a historian and cultural theorist from the Netherlands, and who is regarded as the founding person of modern game studies. And he's really just saying that a game is essentially a setting where you are bound by certain rules, and through learning these certain rules, you're able to progress and reach achievements. Now, when he says a magic circle, it meant a separated physical space or a psychological time period or mindset that you specifically dedicate for the game, where the rules of the outside world, the physical world, doesn't actually interfere. And he gave a lot of examples ranging from sports to what we understand today as video games. So some examples were a football field or softball field or a cricket field, where only the rules of the sport is being applied while a play is in session. The board of a board game, for example, chess or backgammon or any kind of board game. So once you start playing, only the rules of the board game applies. On a more psychological and modern level, if you sit down with your PlayStation for an hour to play a video game, your psychological gears are basically turning in the direction of the rules set out by the game. And the rules must be immutable, as in that the rules can't change halfway through the game. They can change in small means, but not completely, because that really breaks immersion. So people would actually break the fourth wall and say, well, this is not very immersive. I think I'm going to find my way around it. And then it takes players outside of the game and hinders learning. So this magic circle and rules idea is actually the foundations of how games manage to teach, because it puts you in a scenario where we give you a specific set of rules and you have to learn these rules. And through learning the rules and complying with them, you're actually learning a new set of behavioral patterns, or you're learning some important knowledge or skills that you'll continuously practice as you become more familiar with the rules. So some people then say, but aren't games only for fun? I've never heard of games being used for serious purposes. So there's actually plenty of games that we now take for fun, and they were actually developed for serious purposes. So the most famous one is probably Monopoly. Very few people know that Monopoly was actually developed around World War I to teach business students in Yale how to basically do, how to understand the concept of free market and property ownership. It's not until about 1960 or 1950 that the original developers actually sold the rights to a commercial game company, which then made it a commercial game that we enjoy today. So it really was built from the ground up to teach students about how investment works and how property, in terms of investing in property, people can get rich, and loans and all sorts of other free marketing principles. Solitaire, it was actually initially developed to help people understand how to use the mouse when Microsoft first released its platform. Using a mouse can be pretty intuitive for us today, but back in the early 90s and the late 80s, it wasn't actually something a lot of people understood how to use. So Solitaire actually used a lot of the common mechanics that we would need to understand in order to use a mouse. So there's double click, there's single click, and then there's drag and drop. And Solitaire was really designed to showcase how you can these kind of mechanics to manipulate elements in a visual way. And then of course, Scrabble, while being designed as a fun party game, has taught many kids and adults different spelling in different languages. So there's actually a lot of serious games out there that we think are for fun, but they're actually developed with a more serious purpose. And these are just some of the examples of games as defined by Huizinga's definition. So not only do we have sports games and board games and video games, we also have more physical games, stuff you draw on the ground. We have ceremonial games, where if you enter the magic circle of the Stonehenge, you're then bound by the rules of the ceremony or the ritual. If you enter the playground of a kindergarten during play session, you are bound by the rules of whatever game you're playing on the ground. And that really means that games at the end of the day are ideal simulations. So a lot of the times the presence of the magic circle means we can simulate a different kind of reality from what the player is currently going through. And also the magic circle is psychologically safe and it's immersive. It's safe because you are only bound by the rules of the game itself rather than reality. So for example, If you're playing chess with a really muscular guy, then you're both bound by the rules of the chess, and whether or not he might be a physically threatening figure is completely out of the picture. And then the players also learn to understand the big picture of what you're trying to simulate through a cycle of experimentation and self-reflection. And by that, we really meant that games encourage failure and games allow failure. A lot of the times, it is only through failing repeatedly that you go through the cycle of trying different approaches, think about what went wrong, and through that cycle, you understand the rules a bit more, and then you apply your learnings, and then you fail again, and then you understand the rule a bit more. So over these iterations, you're able to gradually understand the big picture and have a holistic grasp of all the rules that you're trying to learn from the game. The rules are immutable in order to create immersion, and it's also a feedback against player skills. So the rules are not changing, but if your skills are improving, then gradually you can get better and better. Conversely, if the rules change all the time, then you can't actually provide very valuable feedback because it's not reflecting your skill improvement. And it also provides ease of learning. So a good game, as you gain more and more mastery, you should find it to be easier and easier to play until that playing it becomes sort of a second nature because you're so ingrained in understanding how the rules work. And there's actually a lot of good research on games, both from a science perspective and from a liberal arts perspective. So one of the most common motivational frameworks that we talk about is the self-determination theory approach, which was basically created and made popular by Ryan and Rigby. And they really talk about how games in their essence is about creating self-determination. It's about making people feel that they're more competent. And therefore, because they feel they're more competent, they have more confidence, and then they create intrinsic motivation. So they would voluntarily want to do this over and over. At the bottom left, we have Barto, who in the early 90s separated different kind of game players into 4 different archetypes. So we have people who like to socialize, so that's interacting positively with players. You have people who like to kill other players, so those are the people who interact negatively with others. And then you have explorers and achievers who are really more interested in interacting with the rules and the world of the game that you've set out. There's been quite a few systematic reviews now on the role of video games in health outcomes. And then nowadays, I believe there are individual systematic reviews for video games in mental health and in improving physical health as well. And serious games is also a big, big market when it comes to teaching health professionals. So there are many serious games out there made to train junior doctors or junior pharmacists or nurses or people who are going through their educational degrees to get these certificates. And it's widely applicable outside of health. So today we're only talking about health, but here we have some Australian examples of training people how to be a rural firefighter. At the bottom left is actually a tourism game developed for the city of Melbourne to promote their tourism. At the bottom right is a Melbourne studio. They made games to basically map out the International Space Station. And then we also have card games, so such as Bex cards made by a GP in Melbourne that basically talks about vaccines and epidemics and viruses. So before I go a bit further, I just want to clarify that serious games and gamification are actually 2 related but separate things. So serious games is usually a full-fledged game developed with purposes more than entertainment. So they contain an entire set of their rules. They usually have a specific setting, and they try to pull you in. They try to not break the 4th wall, and they try to make you believe that you're actually in the game scenario. Gamification is different because that's really just putting some mechanics, such as a point system or a trophy system, into something that's really not a game. So these screenshots I got are actually from Fitbit. If any of you have a Fitbit, you know that they have, I don't know, hundreds of different badges, different trophies. Many things give you scores and points. And even though those scores and points and badges are game-related achievements, you're very well aware as a user that Fitbit is not an actual game. So that's the slight difference between these 2 terms. And because of all that magic circle, self-learning, motivation, reflection we talked about, games are really good at teaching specific aspects of things. So they're really good at teaching complex situations, such as teaching about how people should react in a difficult situation, pandemics in population, emergency room simulations. So all these things allow people to grasp the different factors that influence a very complex situation. By that same logic, it's also really good at teaching systems thinking, such as in hotel management or large-scale management, where you have to think about multiple factors affecting the decision-making. And then lastly, also on that same train of thought, lateral thinking. So times when normal rules of behavior don't apply. You will see a lot of these games in survival and military training, and the Defence Force in Australia and globally uses a lot of serious games to teach troops and commanders how to react in very difficult or very sudden situations. Conversely, games are not so good at teaching some other things. So I know a lot of people have tried to make games to encourage pure recall. So that's literally just memorizing some dates or memorizing facts. Games, because of their complex nature, are actually not good at this, and you'll actually be wasting a lot of time and resources developing a game for pure recall, when books are frankly better than this. A lot of times people also develop games to teach a very rigid procedure or framework. So point by point procedure of how you should behave in certain situations, such as precise procedures. Again, a simulation, either probably like a real simulation, is probably better for this in terms of actual practice. And also simple repetitive activities. All these things are actually better trained in a real training situation where you get to physically practice than say develop a game for it. And games, we've talked about how games are good at more complicated topics because they have very high level of engagement. It draws people in and it causes immersion and intense focus for the player. And we've talked about how it enables constant self-reflection and constant self-experimentation, which means you can essentially do self-directed learning and remote learning. While the student feels its minimal cognitive burden, the teacher also doesn't have to contribute that much from the teacher's perspective. Games also as a way to constantly provide good feedback, and that really makes learning very much more efficient. Just briefly, I'm going to touch upon the intrinsic motivation. That's basically the three pillars of the self-determination theory, to explain how games can be used to fulfill psychological needs. So just briefly, the self-determination theory talks about you need to have self-determination in order to be confident, and you need to be confident in order to have motivation, and you need to have motivation to learn properly. At the end of the day, it argues that good games must create a sense of competency, autonomy, and relatedness in its players. And that means the player must feel that they are competent. So that really means that if they do something good, you reward them accordingly. The players must feel that they are autonomous. So you must give them an ability to choose, and you must make them feel that they have actual personal agency. And they must feel a sense of relatedness. Relatedness is slightly different. So if you have a game where you have multiple people playing at the same time, maybe you can get people to relate to each other. But if you don't have that luxury, then maybe you just want people to relate to the characters in the game or to the rules in the game. And then I'm just going to provide very quickly some commercial examples. So if there's some of you in the audience who play a lot of commercial games, you might recognize some of these examples. So for Competence, we have an active reload mini game. And that really means that that vertical bar is going to keep moving along the horizontal bars. And when you stop it, the gun is going to reload. If you stopped it in the gray out area, as the screenshot has done, then you get a decent reload. But if you stop the vertical bar at the solid white area, a bit to the left of where our current bar is, then you get basically a very good reload. And that really means the more competent you get at basically stopping the bar, the greater rewards you would get. And competence is really about the better you do, the better you get in terms of rewards. So you do feel a sense of progress and competence as your skill levels go up. Autonomy, It can be interpreted in different ways. Here, I've just literally taken a screenshot of games that allow people to approach a goal physically through multiple accesses and pathway. Autonomy can also be on a more meta level, mean that you can choose what you say or what you do rather than physically choosing different routes. But at the end of the day, it means you need to have different approach. You allow people to have different approaches to reach the goal, and these approaches should offer different experiences. Because obviously, if you have 3 different approaches open, but they all feel exactly the same, then that's not really autonomy. And then lastly, relatedness. Relatedness, a lot of that's got to do with universal symbolism, either actually graphic symbolism or in terms of universal emotional connections. And that's also got to do with how you can instantly communicate a lot of the message. So for example, this little alien robot I've got here, even though it bears no semblance of human features, the fact that it's rocking a cradle and that's saying child, child, child would instantly evoke the image of a mother with a young child, even though visually it may not be very much related to humans. So that's my short spiel of, we're still in time, of how the fundamentals behind game design and how psychologically encourages learning. From now on, I'm going to really quickly talk about my project, which happened during COVID-19 in early 2020. This paper is published. This is the full title of the paper. It's a really long paper. There's a really long paper title. But at the end of the day, what we found is that physical activity and mental well-being during the pandemic was actually actively encouraged by augmented reality games, the biggest of which is Pokémon GO. We also looked at basically its sister product, which is called Harry Potter Wizards Unite, and it's set in the Harry Potter universe. But both games basically encourage people to walk outdoors, and despite the pandemic and lockdown measures, it still managed to keep people physically active and mentally healthy. The research kind of started because there was something called Play Apart Together. And this initiative was run by the WHO in conjunction with a lot of big game companies across the world. You may recall that in the early days of 2020, there was a huge drive globally to stay indoors. And this campaign was basically telling people to stay indoors and play video games. And a lot of different companies had online gatherings or online events. They encourage people to spend more of their energy and time indoors. And that's kind of got us to change our initial research, which was just purely looking at how these games affect exercise, to look at how these games have changed the way people are exercising during the pandemic. And before I start to present the results, I just want to thank the team. So we do have a very collaborative, multidisciplinary teams. We've got statisticians in here, we've got interview folks, we've got coders, and we've got nurses. So I just want to thank them before we go on. And then augmented reality for exercise. If you have played or heard of Pokémon GO, which I think a lot of people here would have, you would know what augmented reality games for exercise means. They are basically geolocation based. That means you have to actually go to the physical real world landmarks. And by that design, it actually encourages outdoor exercise because you can't really go to the Sydney Harbour Bridge without physically being there. You have to physically hit there. And the ones that we're looking into are Pokémon GO, released in 2016, and Harry Potter Wizards Unite in 2019. We are also actively looking at Ingress, which is an earlier production, but that data hasn't been analyzed, so I'm not really talking about that today. So just a quick overview of what Pokémon GO actually is. You may have seen how there were hundreds of people walking around with phones, and these are what people actually see in their phones. So to the left is a map of what in game design we call the overworld. So that's basically a more stylized representation of the real world. You can see that the player avatar is standing between 2 purple points. So these are the places in Pokémon GO where you can go to get supplies and resources. You see a little brown fluffy dog-like thing in the a bit to the upper right of the avatar. So that's a Pokemon. You need to tap on it, walk up to it and catch it. You see a kind of a red structure out in the distance. That's what we call a gym. So those things people fight for to get, basically to take possession of. And by winning gym battles, you actually win a lot of coins and in-game currency and resources. And a lot of players would team up in real life to fight gyms controlled by opposing parties. On the right, I've got a GIF of someone actually catching a Pokemon. So you can see the physical action of catching a Pokemon is just that you click on the Pokemon and then you flick a ball at it. The ball does have some changes in terms of velocity and the direction you throw, but at the end of the day, it's a relatively simple finger flick gesture. Harry Potter Wizards Unite works in the exact same idea, except that it's set in the Harry Potter world. So you can see in the left, our avatar now is dressed as someone out of J.K. Rowling's books with a hat, a robe, and all the different houses are basically the exact same landmarks we saw before, except nowadays there are inns and there are greenhouses to grow herbs. And far away in the distance, that spire, I believe that's called a fortress. So just like the gems in Pokemon GO, it can be captured by groups of players and it can be recaptured back. And every time you win it and hold it for a few hours, you get a fairly big amount of rewards. To the right, the GIF portrays how we catch or really subdue creatures in Harry Potter Wizards Unite. You will see that there's a trace that you do have to trace with your finger. So that's a slightly more advanced technique than than Pokemon GO, where you just have to flick the ball. So the trace I've picked to show is actually a relatively simple trace. These traces can get really difficult if you encounter a very difficult creature. So you can actually be drawing twirls and arrows and angles for a long time in this game. Our aim for the study was that we understood augmented reality games relied on outdoor physical exercise to get there, and it relied on social connections in order to do the gym battles and the fortress battles. And we also know that in 2020, COVID basically prohibited all of that. So initially, we were just really interested to assess the impact of COVID on these players in terms of play and well-being. And to do that, we had a mixed method online survey and we deployed it on Reddit. So we went to the subreddits that were dedicated to these two games in May 2020. In our survey, the quantitative data was that we had a mental health measure, the WHO-5. We had self-reported physical exercise measures, and we had self-reported gameplay hours measure. And we asked people to recall before and during the pandemic, because back in May 2020, people are still able to remember how much they roughly played or walked before the pandemic hit. In terms of qualitative data, we had open answer questions that asked about what motivated you to keep playing during the pandemic and the impact of video games on your mental health during the pandemic. Surprisingly, we got a huge amount of participants. The survey was online for 2 weeks and we got 2,147 participants. Here I'm just showing you a general demographic of the participants we got. So gender, relatively okay. We've got 58% male and 41% female. Age, predominantly, we're looking at a young adult range between 25 to 34 years old. That took about 50% of all our respondents. We did have folks as old as 55 responding, and the youngest one we had basically a lower range of 18 because we only got our ethics for 18 and above. In terms of country, about 50% of our participants came from the USA, followed by the UK and Canada, and then the other countries that had a decent sized population were Australia, Germany, and the Netherlands. But overall, we actually had respondents from 66 different countries. It's just that some countries only had single-digit representations. And then once we start to analyze the mental health findings during COVID, as predicted, we found that about half of these participants had poor mental health, and that's decided by a WHO score of less than 13. And then we run statistic analysis, and we found that being female, being of younger age, and being of reduced exercise are significant predictors of poor mental health. These are actually not surprising because if you go and you read other literature published on mental health during the pandemic, you will find that these three factors, female younger age and reduced exercise, have been found again and again to contribute to poor mental health. But what we found very interesting was that less video game play is also a predictor of poor mental health. Probably a bad way to say it, but really it means the more video game you played, you're actually more likely to have better mental health. And then we found that exercise duration is directly linked to video game play. Our participants reported that they only had a decrease of 1 hour of exercise per week on average during COVID. So even during the most severe lockdowns during COVID, for example, participants in England only had 1 hour a day to go out and do anything. These people still had much higher exercise hours than the WHO recommended 150 minutes per week. We also found there was a significantly positive relationship between total hours of gaming and total hours of exercise, both pre-COVID and during COVID. And that really showed us that these games, despite COVID limitations, they're still getting people to go outside, they're still getting people to walk, and people are still holding on to their habit of walking and playing despite what's happening with COVID lockdowns. With that knowledge, we then went to look at our qualitative findings. And then we asked them, why are you still playing Pokemon GO and Harry Potter Wizards Unite during COVID? A lot of the answers involved around for exercise, for fun, to meet new friends, to go into places, and to de-stress. And I'm just going to talk about some of the major themes that we found in our analysis. Obviously, one of the biggest themes, as we expected, was to have a source of entertainment. A lot of participants actually said it's one of their only means for entertainment. So the quote I've got here is from someone who said, "I'm unemployed and I'm trying to fill time. I've run out of hobbies, I've run out of supplies for many hobbies, can't go outside and exercise as often, can't go to the library to get new books, and don't own more expensive versions of digital entertainment." So really, people are just turning to video games, in particular these games, to put their mind off their unemployment or how they are running out of hobbies, they're running out of access to exercise gyms and the library, and they don't really have other means of entertainment. Also, a lot of people said it was a reason to keep exercising. The quote here says, "I can't go to the gym. I have to work at home, so there's no traveling to the job. They've got more spare time and no place to exercise. So they're playing Pokemon GO as exercise. They've already lost some weight. Last week, they walked over 70 kilometers in the middle of a COVID lockdown. And the average would be around 50 kilometers a week for the past 1.5 months. So you can see that a lot of people are actually walking a lot of distances, even though they might just be going around in a big circle, because they are using Pokemon GO as a motivation to go outside and walk. And then you also have other people who say they use the game to have a sense of achievement and challenge. And this actually goes back to what we talked about briefly about giving people self-determination, that sense of competence, sense of autonomy. So the quote here I've chosen, it says, "I've been playing Wizards Unite during the lockdown as a way to fill time and to have an activity that provides a sense of progress and achievement. The person found it enjoyable to complete collections in the game and to see the progress. Events are especially motivating, and it feels like they're engaging with the story and the tasks with the entire community of players." Just from that quote alone, you can kind of feel that this person is getting competence because they feel that they are achieving something and have a sense of progress. They have autonomy, they're choosing to play the game, and they have relatedness with other humans despite the lockdown. And some of the other factors that we didn't, basically I couldn't squeeze into these slides because there are too many, was that people were using the games to retain a routine. So there are people who said, "I wake up at a certain time of the day in order to play Pokemon GO, and that actually keeps me grounded in my routine." To maintain social connections and to create new social connections, for emotional coping and to deal with mental health. Also specifically as a way to keep themselves motivated through life day after day, and also for nostalgia. So just from these aspects alone, we can tell that Pokemon GO and Harry Potter Wizards Unite during COVID was really tapping into those three pillars of the self-determination theory, both as a means to keep people playing and also for the ultimate purpose of keep people walking. And then lastly, we looked at our other question, which is, what do video games mean to you during COVID? And that's where basically everything broke loose and people start to tell us about the really grounding impact of video games that they've experienced during COVID. This very powerful quote I've put down here, someone wrote, "Video games are a rock," as dramatic as that may sound. They were already this person's favorite pastime, but now they're a source of consistency and comfort for me during this unsettling time. One of the biggest themes we found was that people used video games to psychologically escape, to enter the magic circle of video games so they can have temporary relief from the pandemic. The quotes I've picked here says, "They're an important escape, a way for me to think of something other than the dire situations we're experiencing." Someone else said, "Sometimes I think video games are a form of escapism, but gaming is healthier than alcohol." So a lot of people are picking this form of escapism to just have a break from the constant barrage of pandemic news, especially back in May 2020 when it was getting really bad, especially in America and Europe, where a lot of our participants are based. Another thing that a lot of people have highlighted is social connectedness. So how do you stay connected to other people when you can't physically go and see them? For a lot of these people, the answer was you play games with them. People have said that playing games kept the community connected and gave them a sense of normalcy. So they could tell themselves that we were connected before during the pandemic and we're still connected now, even though there's a lockdown. So everything is going to be all right. We also have quotes that said, "I'm really grateful for the feeling of engagement in the community they provide. I have a few friends that play the video games I like, and we socialize in-game directly. Really gives a sense of belonging to the community of players." And we have a lot of people who said they hosted parties in games where everyone would come to the same server or to the same map, and they would socialize with in-game chat. They would socialize with in-game voice chatting, and they would send each other gifts and encouraging messages in-game. And really, apart from escapism or entertainment, gaming has become a new way of interacting with other people in a digital and remote manner. And lastly, one of the very unexpected findings was that people said emotional coping was heavily influenced by video games. And one of the reasons I put the title of this talk as "How They Keep Me Sane" was that sane or sanity was the one word that kept cropping up. At least about 70% of our participants have used the word sane or sanity in some extent in this question. And they keep saying that the games keep me sane. And the quotes I've put here, one of them says, "It's pretty much the only thing keeping me sane. The stress of working in healthcare is tremendous." Essentially, this person works as a frontline worker in America during the height of the pandemic. And gaming at home is really much the only thing that's giving them a sense of normalcy and sanity. The second quote, it says, "Games are very important to me, as I feel like it is the main reason why I haven't lost my sanity yet." And lastly, again, a very profound quote. This person says, "Games are a safe haven in this crisis, allowing me to keep my sanity and to not completely lose faith in humanity, bracket, I hope." And overall, at the end of the day, we gave a final question that says, how have games affected your mental health? And people were allowed to choose either positively, negatively, or neutral. Out of the 1,000 odd people who have answered this question, overwhelmingly, they have chosen a positive answer. About 300 chose neutral, and I think not even 100 chose negative. So at least in our cohort, the vast majority of participants felt that video games was a positive force for their mental health during the pandemic. And ultimately in discussion, we talked about the potential benefit for populations in isolation and distress is significant. And we're wondering whether games can be deployed for these populations outside of the pandemic context. We're wondering whether games will be great virtual socialization for people who are physically or socially isolated because of other causes. The games are also useful as a way to plan for routine, to set goals, and for future planning, as we have seen in these previous quotes. And we wonder whether these kind of tangential benefits can also be used to teach people to better plan, to better set goals, and to set themselves a routine. Pokemon GO and Harry Potter Wizards Unite contributed directly to maintaining exercise because of the way they're designed. And obviously, if we can make something similar to that into a health app, then that would hopefully increase the engagement and motivation of our health app consumers. And then I'm almost finished. We managed to make it onto the Sydney Morning Herald with this finding. If you go to Sydney Morning Herald and you basically Google Pokemon GO or COVID-19, or you Google my name, you're most likely to come across this article where we talked about how Pokemon GO and Harry Potter Wizards Unite really helped some players to keep their sense of routine, keep their sense of normalcy, stay connected with their mates, and just overall keep up a good positive outlook. In terms of future directions, I am planning to do more large-scale online surveys, hopefully with longitudinal follow-ups, so we can understand the longer-term effect of games on mental health. COVID permitting, I was also planning to do some face-to-face assessments, and then basically getting people to play more short-term sessions, and then to see how that affected mental health. I would love to get some preliminary data on using specific kinds of games for mental health prevention, because the information is not presented here, but based on how Harry Potter Wizards Unite and Pokemon GO are designed, these subtle design differences actually had different effects on people's mental health and physical health. Some of the designs were more beneficial for the others, some of the design decisions less so. And ultimately, of course, I'd like some funding, because everything I've presented in the past half an hour is actually completely unfunded. It actually came from the basically voluntary efforts of everyone in my team, which is why I really want to thank them before I started. And I think I am just on time. So this is the end of my talk. Thank you for your time. There are some gifts of people walking around in the two games, some more gifts of people tossing the ball and capturing goblins. If you are a Twitter person, feel free to follow me on Twitter. My personal Twitter is the top one. The second two are my serious game organizations. So if you want to get more involved with that industry, feel free to join those two as well. All right, I'm done. Should I stop sharing?
That's great. Thank you very much, Kathleen. That was wonderful. Yeah, I think go ahead and stop sharing, and hopefully everybody can see both you and me on camera now. So what I'll do is let me first start by saying thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Second, I also wanted to remind people that if you aren't signed up for the Digital Health and Informatics Network, please do so. It's always great to see new people joining the DHIN as well. We have heaps of questions, Kathleen. So I had a bunch of questions that I wanted to ask. I had a bunch of questions that I wanted to ask, but I've asked you quite many of these questions before anyway. The first question was actually one in the Q&A, and that's from Antonio Mitchell, who said, thanks, Kathleen. Do you think gaming could be used to change the way we're delivering rehabilitation for people with specific impairments?
Yes, and it's already in progress. There has been a lot of work done, mostly in America, about rehabilitation using the Xbox Connect or the Wii console. So the ones where you can take the controller and can move around with it. There's also a New Zealand company. They're called Swibo, SWIBO, and they developed a board, a balance board that you stand on. And based on the way you're tilting, you're basically skating through space, but you're also obviously training your balance and lower limb rehabilitation. And the board can be skated on either using 2 feet or just 1 foot. So you can actually do left leg versus right leg rehabilitation adjustment. There is a ton of literature out there. If you just go to PubMed or Google Scholar and you just write rehabilitation serious games, and I think you'll find a lot of resources without me having to give you anything specific, because there's been a lot of rehab work done.
Yeah, we've seen some of that as well. Yeah, that's right. So second question is from Harlot Cheng. You might be addressing this later in your presentation. Will you be collecting follow-up data because of how Niantic are reversing play at distance changes to PokéGo in August 2021?
Yeah, that is literally a survey that we're working on. We're trying to push that out before the start of September. We are not guaranteed to get exact same people because we apply for ethics to do an anonymous survey, so we can't actually follow these people up. But we will be going back to the same communities on Reddit with a question that asks about what's your opinion on these essentially changes being reverted, and also that in America, some of them are saying, oh, we're now post-COVID, so we just want to see if the removal of COVID limitations has changed their behavior yet again in terms of playing.
Okay, next question, because we have a lot and there's one at the end that I really want to get to because I want to ask my question as well. Fiona Hargraves, wondering how Kathleen and her team recruited for the study. Did they find particular social media platforms, gaming networks got better responses? The reason for the question is I'm recruiting right now for a VR trial, and the young male population seems to be a little more difficult to reach than some other demographics.
For me, it's probably a bit different and not very easy to replicate. Basically, I create a very strong personal relationship with the modulators on the subreddits. And what we did is we got all the ethics approved, everything is done, and then we sent the modulators on the subreddits all the information we had. So we had consent forms, all the application forms, everything, and we said, we want to do the study, and this is all the ethics, these are all our obligations. Are you okay with pinning this recruitment thing on your subreddit for a week or 2 weeks? And as we did multiple rounds of recruitment, we actually start to have essentially a friendship with the mods in the subreddit. In terms of, I've actually only ever recruited using Reddit. Personally, I found Twitter and Facebook extremely disappointing, frankly. And depends on how many people you are recruiting, Fiona. If you're just after 20 odd young males, the best way to do it is actually just through social relationships. So if you or your team have friends or family who fit the criteria, get them to get their friends and family. That's actually the most reliable way to go.
Yeah, and for the kind of study that you do with qualitative research and things like that, then the convenience sampling is the right way to go anyway.
Yeah.
Antonio asked, would these activities equally affect everyone, both in terms of uptake of games and in terms of results? Is there merit in exploring how to identify those who would use it the most and those who would benefit the most? If so, how? I guess that's kind of like a dose response curve.
Dose response. I think there is a dose response curve because just in our mental health results, we found that there are people who are very mentally adjusted. They don't need a lot of gaming. They just play for fun. They play for half an hour. They're like, okay, now I've had my fun. I'm going to go back to do whatever else. Folks who are isolated, have existing mental health conditions, or on the verge of having mental health conditions. So those who are kind of pre-depression, pre-anxiety, they need a larger dose to bring them back down or back up to normalcy. That is actually what we found. How you find these people? I guess you give them essentially a self-assessment tool. But obviously nobody has actually done this kind of study before. Nobody has looked at how to relate quantitative depression score or anxiety score with how much dose response you need for games. So if you are keen to explore this, please send me an email afterwards and we can chat more, because that's something I'm interested in and no one has done it yet.
Okay, we've got 10 minutes left and we've got three more questions. So one from Annette, thanks so much for this fascinating talk. How much would you attribute the positive mental effect due to the routine normalcy alone for habitual game players rather than the game as such? Related question. Okay.
Thankfully, I analyzed the starter yesterday. So we found is that people who we asked people questions of how do you brand yourself as a player? And we asked, do you consider yourself hardcore, casual, in between, or no idea? We found that hardcore people during COVID has a mean increase of, I think, 3 hours a week of game. Sorry. Hardcore had a mean increase of 0.6 hours of play. So they're basically playing the same as before. They have an increase of 0.6 hours. That's what 30 minutes, 40 minutes per week. Casual players increase their play by 3.9 hours. So now they're playing 4 hours more. What we're seeing that casual players, their just net delta gain of play just skyrocketed. Hardcore didn't really change. So what we're actually seeing is that I suspect the hardcore players didn't get that much of a boost because life hasn't really changed. But the casual players are really the ones that got a huge change in their routine and their behavior, and they change their behavior based essentially around how to play this game more. So I actually think the casual ones got much bigger boost, change, however you call it, than people who are routinely playing already.
Great. Couple more quick ones. But before you run away, remember to click on the link in the chat that Antonio posted, so you can have a look at that one before you go.
Right?
But yeah, you,
Okay,
Kathleen.
okay.
So let me quickly go to see if you can give this one a quick answer from Natasha. I know this is probably a long answer question. Could you elaborate upon how gamification can improve behavior change in health apps? Not a health app, but I think Duolingo does an amazing job with rewards.
Duolingo's gamification is absolutely amazing. If you have time and you want to think about gamification, everyone in the audience, just go and look at Duolingo's UI. Very beautiful, very engaging. How improve behavior change. Basically, gamification in a nutshell, have Pavlovian teaching, but with stars and badges. But the star and badges have to be meaningful. Same idea as the competence autonomy stuff I talked about. With progress, you show them the progress, give them rewards that's in accordance with the progress. And that's basically the essence of gamification. You're basically giving rewards in order to increase motivation, which means it doesn't always work, but you do have to practice quite a few times for it to work properly. It's probably as brief as I can get. That's the essence of gamification.
Brilliant, and you're handling the onslaught of questions extremely well. One last question before we run out of time from Emma Vanderschiff. So did you find the differences in mental health outcomes of individuals who are engaging in a range of video games outside Pokemon GO and Wizards Unite and those who are only engaging in those games? And the reason I wanted to add on to that question was if you weren't thinking about what other kinds of games people were engaging with in that space, or didn't ask them the question, is there a difference between people who are playing games for escapism? And I've read a paper to suggest that people who use it as escapism don't produce or don't have as good positive outcomes.
Yeah, they're actually the worst ones. One of the worst
outcomes. That's right. But then there are other people who don't necessarily play the games or are involved in the games. They just watch the games online. So they're passive, members of the community.
Watchers.
On Twitch, for example. I guess the question is, were there different mental health outcomes based on the games that people played and their role in the community?
Unfortunately, I have to say we didn't ask that question. What I have seen is that there are actually 3 different subgroups just based on our qualitative finding. The first one is, again, people who just play games for entertainment. So there's like, I've done my playing, I'm done for the day. I know, I don't really care. They don't usually play a lot. They play maybe 1 or 2 games maximum in their lives. And that's really just a side hobby. That takes up about, in my cohort, about 50%. So they're just like, yeah, games, just whatever. And then you have the ones who are really engaged, but they are doing it, they're doing it as a part of their routine. So the hardcore players, the ones who actively routinely play 3 or 4 different games a day, even just logging in. And their social life and their psychological well-being revolves around that subculture. Not in a negative way, it's just that, how do I check up my mates? I check them up in games or in other things rather than through Twitter or Facebook. And then you have the third group, which is actively using games to cope with deteriorating mental health. And that's the most fascinating one because they don't usually play. They play not because they want to, but they play not for the entertainment value, but they play to make themselves feel autonomous, competent, and related. And that's really the very interesting subgroup because they are the ones who may not make it to psychological counseling because they don't want to or whatever. but they are either consciously or subconsciously using games to modulate their mental health. So yes, there is a difference, but you really, really, really have to dig into the data to see it. And it's most of that is in qualitative data anyways.
Players treatment. I really like that. Kathleen, as always, fantastic. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We've completely run out of time, but it was really good. Please add your comments in the chat to thank Kathleen for the presentation. You can see them all flooding there.
Thank you for your time, everybody.
It was an absolute pleasure having you, and for everybody else, hopefully I'll see you all in 4 weeks time to see Tom Loveday present, and remember to sign up to the DHIN if you haven't already. And thank you again, Kathleen, and good luck for your talk this afternoon too.
Thank you Adam and Jack for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. All right. Thanks everybody. See ya.